You're listening to the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast. Remember to like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the bell to make sure you get the latest episodes of the podcast. Be sure to like and share our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. Hi everyone and welcome back to another episode of the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast. On today's episode of the podcast, we review the ODI series between Australia and England. It's the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast and let's get started. Let's have a look at the series results from the ODI series between Australia and England. The first ODI was played at the Adelaide Oval. Australia won by 6 wickets and Darwin Milan was named Player of the Match. The second ODI was played at the SCG. Australia won by 72 runs and Mitchell Starc was named Player of the Match. The third and final ODI of the series was played at the MCG. Australia won by 221 runs on Duckworth Lewis. Travis Head was named Player of the Match. Australia won the series 3-0 and David Warner was named Player of the Series. Let's have a look at Australia's performance with both bat and ball in this ODI series against England and talk about their performance in this ODI series overall. After a disappointing T20 World Cup from Australia, they have bounced back well, winning this ODI series 3-0 over England. Australia batted and bowled well than England in this series. Even though this series didn't have any significant context in terms of qualification for next year's 50-over World Cup in India, Australia have started their preparations for next year's Cricket World Cup in India in a perfect way. And they will be very happy with how they perform throughout this whole series, Australia, with both bat and ball. All 3 games they played better than England, and that reflected in the results during this series. So let's talk about the batting and let's talk about how the batters went about things in this series. Let's have a look at the batting stats. Leading run scorer was Travis Head with 240 runs, Warner 208, Smith 195, Mitchell Marsh 80, Labuschagne 70, Carey 33, Stoinis 25, and Green 20. That's how the Australian batters went about things in this series against England. Now, Australia's batting was good throughout the whole series. Much improved batting performance compared to the earlier series this summer against Zimbabwe and New Zealand. We saw consistency from Australia's top order, which was good to see for a change. No batting collapses. Throughout this series, we saw how good of a start the top order provided Australia and gave them the platform to get competitive totals. It's important going forward for Australia that the top order provide these good starts and consistency. Also, a change in opening partnership has helped as well, with Travis Head coming in to replace Aaron Finch to open the batting with Warner. And that opening partnership throughout this series has been pretty good for Australia, producing runs and runs, especially in the first game in Adelaide. And also in the last game in Melbourne, the opening partnership has fired in this series for Australia, which is good to see. Unlike when Aaron Finch was still playing, the opening partnership wasn't quite what it was. So very good batting from Australia across the board. I thought they did the basics very well. They did the basics well with the bat, rotated strike, built partnerships, batted smartly. They weren't reckless. They measured their positive intent and approach with good cricket shots. They put the England bowlers under pressure. And it was just a good batting performance across the board, really, which is good to see from Australia. You want to see that. And throughout this series, their scores were pretty consistent. In Game 1, they got 291 for 4. Game 2, 280 for 8. Game 3, 355 for 5. So their scores throughout the whole series were pretty consistent, and they were backing up each innings as they went, which is good. Let's talk about some of the batters. Let's talk about Travis Head quickly. He batted well in the series, leading run scorer, 240 runs. Got an opportunity to open the batting with David Warner in this series and made the most of the opportunity given to him. Batted well in Adelaide, missed out in Sydney, but cashed in Melbourne. His century in Melbourne showed why Travis Head is good in the limited formats of the game, obviously. Attacking, positive, aggressive batting from him throughout the whole series really made his case to the selectors for that opening spot in the World Cup next year with David Warner. And I think that could be the opening partnership that Australia take to the 50-over World Cup next year in India. David Warner, let's talk about him. 208 runs in the series. Batted well in this series towards the end of his career, but still scoring runs when Australia needed it the most. Good century from him in Melbourne, 106. That's his first century in any format for Australia since 2020. That was in January, so 2 years without scoring an international century. But very good partnership he had with Travis Head in the last game in Melbourne, of course, of 269 for the first wicket, which was a very good partnership, which really set Australia on their way to win the last game of the series in Melbourne. He's batted well. Good signs ahead for the Australian summer, that David Warner's really scoring runs and firing. Another batter that Australia will be happy about seeing scoring runs and in good touch is Steve Smith. Batted well in this series, 195 runs. Back in form, good rhythm and fluency with his batting. Played 2 good innings in Adelaide, where he looked at his absolute best when he got that 80-odd in Adelaide. In Sydney, his innings was key on a pitch that was slow, dry, and taking his turn. So good signs for Australia going forward, and for the rest of the summer, going into the Test series against the West Indies and South Africa, that Steve Smith is scoring runs. Now, the other Australian batters, Labuschagne, Mitchell Marsh, Carey, Stoinis and Green, they had a few indifferent performances throughout the series. Mitchell Marsh batted well. He got a 50 in the second game in Sydney. Marnus Labuschagne got a 50 in Sydney as well. Hasn't really nailed his spot in this one-day side for Australia, but he scored a good half-century in Sydney. Marcus Stoinis had a quiet series with the bat in this series. He got 25 runs in this series, so very quiet series from him. And Cameron Green only batted once in this series. He only played the first game in Adelaide, so not much to add on to the Australian batting performance throughout this series. I thought they batted well. As I mentioned, did the basics well, and it's good to see the Australian batters finally starting to score runs and being consistent. And that's what we didn't see in the series early in the summer against Zimbabwe and New Zealand in those one-day series. But we're starting to see that now in this series against England. So that's good signs for Australia going forward. So overall, a very good batting performance from Australia in this one-day series against England. Let's have a look at the Australian bowlers and their performance throughout this ODI series against England. The leading wicket taker for Australia in the series was Adam Zampa with 11. 5 wickets for Cummins and Stark, 3 wickets for Hazelwood, 2 wickets for Abbott, and a wicket each for Marsh and Stoinis. That's how the Australian bowlers went about things in this ODI series against England. Now, Australia's bowling, just like their batting in this ODI series, was pretty good in the series. Coming into this ODI series, the bowling group had a tough time of it during the T20 World Cup. And as we know, during that T20 World Cup, the bowling was poor. They didn't do anything right. Leaking runs, not really executing their skills, all that basic stuff that we associate with bowling in cricket. But during this ODI series against England, the bowling was much improved. I thought Australia did the basics well with the ball. They bowled good lines and lengths. They executed their plans and skills with the ball, picked up wickets at regular intervals, bowled dot balls to apply pressure onto the England batters. And they just really did the basics well in this series. As we saw in the T20 World Cup, they didn't quite do that at times throughout that T20 World Cup campaign. But in this ODI series against England, they did do the basics well. They were able to execute the basics well. And they were able to put England under pressure and bowl them out for very good scores in this series. As we have a look at some of the scores they bowled them out for in this series, quite a few scores in the 200s, and in the last game in Melbourne, they bowled them out in the 140s. So in the first game in Adelaide, England were 287 for 9. Second game in Sydney, 208 all out. Last game in Melbourne, 142 all out. So that just shows that the Australian bowling was pretty good, and the England batting was quite poor, to be honest, to them. But the Australian bowling, very good. Adam Zampa led the way with 11 wickets. Everyone else chipped in and did their role. Adam Zampa, very good leg spinner, continues to get better and better. Pat Cummins had a good series. Mitchell Stark bowled very well, especially in the second game in Sydney, where he bowled that amazing first over to get rid of Roy in Milan. Josh Hazlewood is good as always. Sean Abbott only came in for the last game but bowled well. Mitchell Marsh took a wicket, and same with Stoinis. So all the Australian bowlers contributed in some way and really supported one another. And it's good to see Australia really bowling well and really executing their skills with the ball. And it's good signs going forward, especially heading into the World Cup. You want to see all the bowlers firing and doing their role. But in this series, by far they're out-bowled England. And they perform better than the England bowlers. So a very good series from the Australian bowlers in this ODI series against England. So overall, a very good bowling performance from Australia in this ODI series against England. Let's have a look at England's performance with both bat and ball in this ODI series against Australia and talk about their performance in this ODI series against Australia. For England, they'll be disappointed with how they played in this ODI series against Australia, even though this series was straight after the T20 World Cup. England suffered a bit of T20 World Cup hangover. A lot of the players didn't look interested. They didn't want to be here, even though the series didn't have any significant context or meaning to it whatsoever. But still, they'll be disappointed in the way they performed in most of the games in this series, obviously. When you're playing for your country, you want to still put in good performances and you really want to try and, do your best. Unfortunately for them, in this series, England, it wasn't quite, their best performance throughout the three games. But, T20 World Cup coming off that, a bit of a hangover, and it was sort of expected that they were going to play this way, and it turned out to be the case. So England rested some of their players who featured in the T20 World Cup, like Butler, Ali, Sam Curran, Wokes were rested. So they didn't play their full strength 11, giving other players an opportunity to show what they're made of and give them a bit of some game time to really push their case to the selectors. But across the board, their batting and bowling just didn't get going in the series, didn't really fire. And to be honest, that T20 World Cup hangover was clear to see. Now let's have a look at their batting performance and talk about their batting throughout this series. Leading run scorer was Dawood Malan with 136 runs, Billings with 95, Vince with 87, Roy 39, Salt 37, Butler 30, and Ali 28. Their batting was poor throughout the whole series, didn't get going with the bat at all in this series. They had batting collapses in Adelaide, they had a batting collapse, nearly got bowled out for under 100. In the end, if it wasn't for Dawood Malan's century of 134, that game would have been over very early. In Sydney, they were in a good position to chase down Australia's target of 281 runs. Unfortunately, they got bowled out for 208. They lost 4 for 13 inside 3 overs. And they had a good partnership between Sam Billings and James Vince. It was 122 for the 4th wicket. And that partnership was getting England into some sort of control in the match. And then all of a sudden, Vince gets out for 60, LBW to Hazlewood, and then the batting collapse of 4 for 13 happened. They lost 4 wickets in 3 overs, and that batting collapse pretty much determined the game in game number 2. And pretty much that turned in Australia's favour. In Melbourne, got bowled out for 142. Didn't really look like chasing the target of 364 on Duckworth-Lewis adjusted there. Didn't really look interested. Didn't really look like they were going to chase down the runs. Lost wickets at regular intervals. Had a massive batting collapse. I think at one stage there were 7 down for 95. So just bit of an indication on how their batting was in that last game of the series, and with the other games as well with the batting collapses. So they had a few of those in this series, England. They didn't build partnerships at all in this series, didn't do the basics well enough with the bat. Dawood Malan's century was the highlight for England in the series. Some of the batters made most of their opportunities and others didn't. James Vince certainly did in Sydney when he got that 60 score. Billings did the same in Sydney as well. He got 71. Jason Roy, who's coming back into the side after being dropped from the ODI and T20 side for England. He's out of form. Didn't really make the most of his opportunities given to him in this series. So, yeah, England's batting throughout the whole series was a bit of a mixed bag. It wasn't their best performance, not their best performance as a batting group in an ODI series for some time. So overall, it was a poor batting performance from England in this ODI series against Australia. Let's have a look at the England bowlers and their performance in this ODI series against Australia. Ollie Stone and David Willey were the leading wicket takers with 4 wickets each for England. 3 wickets for Rashid, 2 wickets for Wokes and Dawson, and a wicket each for Ali and Jordan. That's how the England bowlers went about things in this ODI series against Australia. England's bowling was a bit of a mixed bag, just like their batting in this ODI series. Didn't do the basics well enough with the ball, didn't bowl good lines and lengths, didn't execute their lines and lengths either, didn't execute their plans and skills with the ball, didn't build pressure with the ball onto the Australian batters. The bowling performance in the last game in Melbourne was their worst performance with the ball in the series. Conditions suited their bowlers, overcast skies, grass on the surface, swing and seam, but they bowled poorly. Warner and Head, the partnership between David Warner and Travis Head really put them under pressure with the ball from the get-go. England couldn't counteract that pressure from Warner and Head and really suffered. And also in that game, didn't really look like they were going to take a wicket. Everyone was pretty down on body language, and that's understandable given the T20 World Cup hangover, given that this series didn't count towards anything, no context, no relevance. You could see that the bowlers were really going through the motions in that last game. So nothing much to add onto it, really. England's bowling was pretty poor across the board, even though they didn't play their best bowlers throughout the series at times. The other bowlers who came in, like a Stone, Luke Wood, who made his debut in the first game in Adelaide, Liam Dawson, they did take their opportunities and they did take wickets. And, for them, I suppose that's confidence boosting going forward and just letting the selectors know that, we can be very good in the T20 World Cup squad as well. But for England, in their one-day cricket, they've got tremendous depth. And it was an opportunity for some of those guys in terms of the batting and bowling side of things to really put their case for selection for the World Cup next year. So their bowling, England, pretty much, just to sum it up in a nutshell, didn't really do the basics well enough. It was inconsistent and just didn't do the basics well enough. If you do the basics well enough with bat and ball, you're going to have success. But if you don't do the basics well enough with both bat and ball, you're not going to have success and you're going to struggle. And that's what we saw from England in this series. So, yeah, overall, a poor bowling performance from England in this ODI series against Australia. This ODI series didn't have any significant meaning or context behind it, but both teams gave opportunities to players to see what they can do and have some other options they can turn to for the World Cup next year in India. Australia will be happy with this 3-0 series win, and their World Cup preparations have started off on the right note. They batted and bowled well, which will give them confidence going forward. England suffered from T20 World Cup hangover, and it showed in their performance with both bat and ball in the series. Well, that's all the time we have for this episode. Be sure to subscribe and click the bell to get the latest episodes of the podcast, and like and share our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. Until next time, keep safe and bye for now.